Hi, I'm Stephen Bauman, and today we're going to be talking about Bargue drawings. But first, I want to give you a little background on this new content model that I'm working on. I have some new live streaming equipment that gives me the possibility to kind of create some dynamic content, but pretty quickly. And this is going to be the first of hopefully many installments of me kind of talking about subjects that I think you guys are really interested in because you're contacting me about it, but also stuff that I think is just kind of cool and educational. So let's start out first with this question. It's from a guy named Phil Bennett, who's a Patreon subscriber of mine. So this is the message that Phil sent to me, and I'm just going to cut to the parts that are actionable for our purposes. He writes, self-education is where the purpose of my message comes in. If you don't mind me asking, of course. I'm trying to organize my own journey in a purposeful way. Your conceptual sphere and pair tutorials have been absolutely outstanding in this regard. My question is concerning Bargue plates. It's my understanding that you and so many others have spent time with the plates during your education. I wonder how much time should be given to the practice and study of the plates. So what are Bargue drawings, first of all? Bargue drawings were a set of lithographs made by an artist named Charles Bargue in the 19th century for the École des Beaux-Arts in France. It was there to replace an old drawing course that was made with a little bit of a different philosophy in mind. I was introduced to it first at the Florence Academy of Art where I studied, and there's a couple other schools around the world that use this. And in fact, probably right now, a lot of different ateliers are using this because graduates from these various academies have gone out and started their own schools. And so really, Bargue drawings have kind of come back into the norm for a lot of ateliers and students training in that way. But I want to spend some time with the plates themselves, so let's switch cameras and get to the actual drawings themselves and talk about and maybe dissect some of the concepts and purposes behind spending your time with Bargue drawings. So this is the cover of the Charles Bargue drawing course, and this book came out maybe not too long ago. When I was first starting to study at the Academy, I think this book had come out very recently, and I remember going to an exhibition at the De Hesche Museum, which was in the IBM building in Manhattan at a certain point in time. And that's where I sort of bought my first copy of it. It was a great book full of really fantastic artworks by Charles Bargue and Jean-Léon Gérôme and other artists. I think eventually probably Charles Bargue was the prize of that group. I think in a way he was one of the greatest painters to come out of that moment in art history. But that's a matter for opinion. If you get to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, there's a really great painting that he made there. I believe it's called the Sentinel. Maybe I'll actually take some time and talk about that later on in this series. But here we come to one of the Bargue plates that I wanted to talk about. And you got to understand the Charles Bargue drawing course was something that has like a really long timeline. I don't know if there's quite 100 of them, but there's really a lot of drawings in this series. They start out with the most kind of basic things like, drawing an eye, from the side like this, like the most simple version of a drawing that you can make. That was where they started out, and eventually they become really, really complex, and you're drawing things like the Belvedere torso, which inevitably I'm going to take some time and talk about much later on. But let's start with this, right? This one is maybe not quite an intermediate Bargue drawing, but certainly it's not the most simple, definitely not the most complex. But I thought that it was representative of a couple of the really important and very basic ideas that Bargues are trying to communicate. So among them, the interesting things that you want to think about with Bargue is how he simplifies things. So let's take a look at this area right here, right? We can see an area on the kind of finished version of this, right, that is communicating like a lot of different angle breaks and a lot of complexity. And here, in the drawing that he's made on the left, which is essentially just there to indicate to you like what a block-in or a simplification or the beginning stage of making a drawing like this should look like, he's taking those sort of like 10 or 20 different angle breaks and boiled them down into basically just these kind of 3 line segments, right? And you could say even that if we take a look at the actual set of line segments there, he's really boiled all those down to kind of one slightly convex line segment that kind of ends at these 2 kind of meetings, right, with these other angle breaks, right, or these other line segments. This is really important. The sense of like angle breaks and relatively straight lines in place of complexity, it really can't be overstated that this is one of the most important things that you can understand from what Bargue's practice is. The reason that we would do anything like that would be because we want to understand how complexity can be simplified to give us flexibility in a drawing, right? What we understand in a good block-in is that it's really impermanent. A lot of the lines that we're going to use here are going to be lines that are going to be really subject to change very rapidly. In fact, for me, the early stages of my drawings, the lines that I'm making, I keep them light, I keep them loose for the purpose or the understanding of knowing that I need to really establish the entire drawing before I can actually approach something like accuracy. And that comes back to these angle breaks, right, and these line segments. in one moment, these angle breaks and line segments are there to kind of represent the subject. In another, they're there to cross-reference with all of the other passages within the drawing. So this little meeting of two lines here can also be compared on a vertical axis, right, with the meeting of these two line segments here. And the distance in between those on a vertical axis can be helpful in indicating the location of one in relationship to the other. Now that's something you want to just save for later, right, is that it's all about interrelationship. One point alone in space really, in a sense, cannot quite be accurate in and of itself. It has to relate well to all the other subjects around it. So I'm comparing that one first on this vertical axis, but you can look also on a horizontal axis at other angle breaks that it meets up with around the subject, right? You can also compare various diagonals throughout this sort of 2D space that we're organizing here. This one, like these kind of diagonal comparisons, are a little bit more variable. I find that horizontal and vertical axis comparisons are usually a little bit more reliable. You know, it's a little bit easier to kind of determine what a perfect vertical is than it is a sort of randomly chosen diagonal. But nonetheless, we can still kind of eyeball it. We can like take the edge of our pencil and kind of compare this line segment down here to another. The other thing you can do also is just look actually at where this is pointing to, right? If I get that angle correct, it should kind of correlate well to this sort of axis here. But I digress. These line segments and these meetings that we'll call angle breaks are there both to, like I said, represent the subject, but also to be used as a tool to kind of compare to the other kind of passages of the drawing to make sure that your block-in gets hopefully as accurate as it possibly can. That's the goal here eventually, right? So another interesting thing that we can consider is like what concept is this trying to kind of tell us about? And this is where, you know, to come back to Phil's question, should I spend a lot of time with Bargue drawings? The answer is sure. I mean, you can draw a lot of things and make progress. One of the things that makes these Bargue drawings so useful today is that you have a lot of teachers, you know, myself included, who spent a lot of time working with them as a student, who spent a lot of time teaching them at various academies, and can act as a kind of guide to help you understand what it is inside these drawings that is actually interesting. You could draw them, of course, just on your own and definitely make some progress and gain some knowledge. But really in each drawing, there's a specific set of ideas that it's trying to tell you about. Now let's illustrate how that works, right? So in this drawing in particular, there are a couple ideas that are super important. One is the shadow shape, light shape dichotomy, right? Let's look at this and see that we have these really crystal clear shapes of light indicated in relationship to a almost totally unified shadow value, right? This is hugely important because it points us towards this idea that shadow is atmosphere and light is form. Now, saying that on its own can be vaguely interesting, but unpacking what that's about is how it becomes useful, right? So when you think about atmosphere, what we're really talking about is unity, and we're describing a phenomenon that is not unlike atmospheric perspective, right? When you're looking at a mountain range in the distance, and in between your eye and that sort of mountainside that's full of rich detail and you know, different value shapes and so on, gets muted by all of the sort of dust and you know, bits of water, what is it, like water droplets that are kind of floating around in the atmosphere, right? All of those things combined over that distance tend to kind of flatten out the value of something and unify it. And what we're doing here is actually kind of creating that effect, even though the depth in between us seeing the subject, which we're imagining, right, that this is an actual kind of 3D sculpture that he's looking at, and that this shadow actually in itself is kind of full of detail, that he has taken a artistic choice or a purposeful choice to kind of unify away probably 99% of the value variation that you'd see in here. I mean, think about it, like of course on this old sculpture there'd be like kind of cracks and little plane shifts that are happening. Maybe there's even an ear back here. Probably if there was an ear he would have included it. But suffice to say there would be some value change happening in there. But he has taken it and said, well, for my purposes I'm not going to get into that. No better place is this expressed than right here. We would understand implicitly, right, that there's a difference in between the shape, the kind of bottom plane of the nose and the kind of front plane of the muzzle form, right? And that if there was any light bouncing around inside of this space, that light would be affecting this plane and this plane in slightly different proportions, right? That's why we always get that sense of like reflected light on the bottom plane of the nose. that kind of shows you a little bit more the nostrils, right? But here he's taken that and totally unified it away to the extent that we don't see almost any value change there whatsoever, right? So this is a very case in point, like a critical example of shadow as atmosphere and light as form. Now, what does that do for you? That reveals a little bit more and kind of casts into greater importance, right, the design of the shadow shape itself. And just like the contours in the block-in, that shadow shape has line segments and angle breaks. Those line segments and angle breaks themselves become tools that you can compare to one another to triangulate and create a holistic sense of accuracy, right? So there are kind of so many layers to the lessons that you can kind of learn from these Bargue drawings. However, like I said, you just need a little bit of a starting point to help you unpack them. I think there's probably a lot of documentation out there, not least of which in the book that I mentioned that this is in. But also there's a lot of teachers out there that have worked on Bargue drawings and studied Bargue drawings with other instructors. So there's a lot of learning around them at the moment. And I think with just a little bit of research before you spend your time drawing a Bargue drawing or copying a Bargue drawing, I think that they can become even more valuable. If you're just intent upon sketching them because you like them and that's nice, I think that that's great, but probably I wouldn't invest the greatest amount of your time because only drawing them alone without feedback, probably you're going to get half of what they're supposed to give you. Another interesting point that we can bring up here that's really useful and also uncommon to kind of students that are just starting out drawing is the absolute or the almost absolute lack of halftone value within the light shape, right? So we already established that there's going to be this dichotomy in between the shadow shape and the light shape. You can just almost just draw a line entirely around the light shape. It's an unbroken edge in between light and shadow. And those shapes on either side of that shadow line have almost no value variation inside of them. This is so particular to Bargue drawings. If you looked at the course, the drawing course that was around before Bargue drawings, right? I don't know who the artist who designed it was, but it was full of cross-hatching, like ornate cross-hatching, like you'd see like on like the etching of a dollar bill or whatever. And this is kind of interesting too. However, you know, it definitely represents the other side of the coin in terms of how you recreate visual phenomenon. Back to these light shapes. Let's kind of take a look for a moment. Only right here do we actually see any meaningful halftone planes represented within the light shape. Everything else in that light shape, maybe with the exception of this little trailing sort of halftone shadow that's emerging out from the shadow edge, everything except that is almost totally unified away, and we have this sense of kind of unity within the lights, which is characteristic of the kind of early stages of a drawing that's done in this manner, which is to say that we're starting from something very simple and moving on to complexity, all the way until, you know, we have a really highly refined and detailed drawing. So, you know, this could be one stage, right? This could be a second stage, and the reality, wow, let me redraw that too. This could be a second stage. And really you could have subsequent stages after that that would increasingly kind of inform the impression of the subject by creating more complex halftone values, turning the form a little bit more. There's a lot of different things that you can kind of start to add to this to help indicate an even greater degree of complexity. But for the sake of this lesson, right, for the sake of this subject, he's kind of stayed here just to give you that indication of that really basic phenomenon or that dichotomy between shadow and light. So just to return really briefly to Phil's question, should you spend time with Bargue drawings? I think you absolutely should. Why wouldn't you? They're out there, they're useful, and if you kind of enjoy that aesthetic, you can definitely gain a lot from it. That being said, I'm always someone who likes to give a balanced opinion, and I also want to put out there that there's a limit to how focused you want to be on Bargue drawings. They're great to get you over that first stage of not knowing how to block in a drawing, not knowing what to do with your values initially, and eventually to come to a pretty complex understanding of the basics of drawing. But in reality, we eventually need to confront three-dimensional subjects. So here's your takeaways from this early stage of the Bargue drawing program. There's a few key concepts represented in each Bargue. In this one, we talked about straight lines, we talked about angle breaks, and also a really basic shadow shape, light shape dichotomy. If you can start to use those concepts to organize visual phenomenon, it's going to assist you in having a sense of flexibility and breadth at the early moments of your drawing. So that's where we're going to leave it for today. Even though there's a lot more meat on the bone in terms of the Bargue drawing course, I'm going to get into that in some later videos. Thank you so much for watching, and if you like the content on this channel, please remember to like and subscribe. And if you're interested in more in-depth tutorials about portrait drawing and portrait painting, you can visit my Patreon page. I'm pretty sure that a little pop-up link happened here or here. So if you want to learn more, please follow that link and find me on Patreon.